Man, I almost always go Intel and Nvidia when it comes to my personal builds, and to be honest, it gets a little boring after a while. I haven't been on an AMD platform for my personal rig since probably the Athlon 64. For what I do, which is primarily gaming and editing in the Adobe suite, the Intel platform just makes the most sense, both with single core speed and Adobe's recent adoption of the QuickSync technology. It just makes the most sense for my primary rig. But I've always been curious about AMD. I've always wanted to have a Ryzen build, and I always told myself I would do that if the use case scenario was compelling enough, and I think I found one. You're looking for cheap PC games? Check out Kinguin.net. Click the link in the description below to help support the channel and never pay full retail again. Yo, I'm Brian P. You're watching Bad Seed Tech, and today I'm setting out to build a silent, dedicated streaming PC on the AMD Ryzen X470 platform with a mountain of cooling components courtesy of Be Quiet. This is going to be a dedicated capture, encoding, and streaming PC, so I needed a CPU with a lot of cores, and I needed that chip to perform and stay cool for extended periods of time, so this felt like the right time to look at Ryzen. Now, one disclaimer about this build before we get going. It's weird. Some of the choices are weird. Some of the stuff is overkill because it may get repurposed in the future. Some of it I simply had laying around in the parts closet, and there's also a chance I may use this machine as a secondary rig to test other hardware in the future. Point is, this is not a strategic or a best value for your dollar build, and I'm sure people will have lots of ideas and very strong opinions about things I could have done differently. Okay, now let's go. So the case I've chosen here is the Be Quiet Silent Base 601. This is an evolution from the Silent Base 600 that released a couple of years ago, and it's been refreshed with some more modern aesthetics and amenities. I hadn't initially planned on it, but I am going to do a full deep review on this case in the very near future because there's a lot to like here, but there are some very important opportunities that you need to be aware of, and it's just too much to get into for the scope of this video. So the goal of this build was to get as close to silent as possible with the machine under load. That made the 601 a strong contender, but I knew I was going to have to sacrifice some airflow and some cooling in exchange for noise dampening. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the roof of the case, where you have a tray that allows you to mount three 140mm fans. But there's only venting in the top panel at the rearmost fan mounting position. The front two fan positions are obstructed by noise dampening material. You'll see noise dampening material all throughout this case, and it's 10mm thick. I've never seen that before. There also could be some challenges here with the front panel because it's basically just a flat rectangle of noise dampening material and two 90-degree vents on either side. That's your only intake on the front. As for fans, this case comes standard with two 140mm Pure Wings fans. These are some solid entry-level fans, but Be Quiet also shipped out a stack of their top flight Silent Wings 3 fans. They're PWM, 1000 RPM max, and rated at 15.5 dB, and they include multiple mounting options. Due to the restrictions in the roof, I wound up using 3 in the front panel, 1 in the roof, and 1 on the exhaust. I could have populated the top rack with all 3 and included 1 in the basement, so this case includes support for up to 8 total 140mm fans. Now, I'd originally planned on using the 601's integrated fan controller, but it had some restrictions, so I decided to go a different way. Number 1, it's only going to support 3-pin fans, and it only supports up to 3 of them, so the 4-pin PWM fans were a no-go anyway. So I tossed in a Silverstone 8-way PWM SATA-powered fan hub, which was not the move. Not only did it fail to supply enough power to the fans to where they wouldn't start unless they were all set to full speed, but I truly believe that it compromised one of the fan headers on the motherboard. So I took it out back and put it down. Luckily, this board is very generous with the PWM fan headers, so I found routing for all 5 case fans plus the CPU cooler, so everything worked out great. So the processor here is the AMD Ryzen 2700X, which I'm actually not overclocking in this particular build because 1, I'm attempting to keep temps in this build as low as possible to mitigate the need for more aggressive and noisier case fans, and 2, because this machine will be recording or streaming for long hours and I need it to be as stable as possible. This is all going on a Gigabyte RS X470 Gaming 5 Wi-Fi board. I could have easily gone with an MSI Tomahawk B350 or B450 here, but as I believe this rig will eventually house an SLI or a Crossfire setup, I wanted to be forward thinking. Plus, I kind of like the orange and black. Memory is 16 gig of Corsair Vengeance 2666. Wouldn't have been my first choice here. I would have preferred something faster given Ryzen's thirst for memory speed. But again, this is what I had on the shelf. This will be cooled by the massive Dark Rock Pro 4. I've got a review for this on the channel already if you'd like to check it out. Not being overclocked, this thing should be able to handle the most stressful load with ease. It's going to add an additional 135mm and an additional 120mm Silent Wings 3 fan. Without overclocking here, I believe the standard Dark Rock 4 would have sufficed, but this is what I had on deck. Storage is a Samsung 1TB 860 EVO SSD, and that's it. And yes, I can definitely see where having a huge hard drive in here to store large 4K captures would make sense, especially being able to leverage AMD's Store MI technology. But the truth is, I just hate having hard drives in my system. No matter how I tweak the OS, they always feel like they slow things down, even when I'm not immediately using them. Of course, I may change my tune when I see how fast I fill this thing up. I'd actually consider going with the small NVMe drive as a system drive, so I wasn't recording to the same hard drive where the system and OBS was running, but in testing, it looked like I had plenty of overhead for throughput, so it's not something I'm going to prioritize right now. Powering this rig is the Be Quiet Straight Power 11 1000 watt, one of the best looking PSUs I've ever seen. And yes, it's absolutely massive overkill, especially when you see the GPU that's going in this thing. But again, we're being forward thinking. For capture card, I went with the highly capable and affordable AverMedia Live Gamer 4K. This card can pass through and capture HDR in addition to 4K 60. It's simply the best feature set you can get for your money in a 4K 60 capture card, but it does require a pretty beefy system to run in, and it asks for a minimum GTX 1060 for a GPU. So naturally, I went with the GTX 1050 Ti because it's what I had on the shelf. This card is really small. It's about the same size as the capture card itself and doesn't require any additional power from the PSU. It's powered entirely through the PCIe lane. Remember when I said that 1000 watt PSU was overkill? Does it work? Yeah, I mean, for the most part. There's enough meat on the bones there to do an entire other video on just that topic alone. But that would be dick, so we're gonna do it here instead. For testing, I used the Forza Horizon 4 demo, live gameplay on the Xbox One S, and on the PC, I used the benchmark set to ultra settings. Fortunately, my gaming PC was stout enough to maintain 60 FPS at 4K on ultra for testing. So, what works? I was able to bring in the Horizon 4 benchmark in native 4K from the PC, stream it at 6 megabits per second at 720p with X264 encoding, while locally recording a 4K 60 FPS VOD at 100 megabits per second using NVENC. The 4K capture looked smooth and the system handled it no sweat. CPU usage was 52% max at 54 degrees, and that was with the CPU encoder set at slow. Now, capturing HDR requires the use of AverMedia's own capturing software, Rec Central 4. Capturing the Xbox One S at 4K 60 HDR ran the GPU up to about 85% usage max and didn't tax the CPU past like 12%, so that was a win. So, what didn't work? Switching to the native 4K output on the PC with HDR enabled saw that GPU spike to like 99, 100%, 3 or 4 times throughout that benchmark run, so that's going to be a no-go for this card. A quick note here about actually handling 4K 60 HDR files. These files are crazy huge and easily crippled my beast of a rendering PC. Even trying to transcode these files in Adobe Media Encoder took forever. I couldn't even scrub the timeline with anything that resembled consistency. It just like skipped from point to point, and every time it did, you could feel the fans in the system just strain to figure out where that playhead was supposed to land. So we'll take a GPU upgrade to handle these at some point, but honestly, I don't know what point that would be. So the fact is, the system is able to capture regular 4K at seriously high bit rates, way over 100 megabits per second, and still perform great. Only if you're specifically recording HDR do you need the GTX 1060 minimum. And unless you just enjoy torturing yourself for that very small audience of people who are able to properly display HDR content, I'm not sure why you'd even bother. That HDR pass-through is clutch though. So did the build hit the mark? Yeah, for the most part. But none of the testing I've shown to this point has really pushed the PC enough to really make it struggle to cool the components. As such, the build has remained damn near silent, and with very manageable temps. So I fired up the Ada64 torture test, taxing everything except the SSD, and let it rip. After 15 minutes, the highest spike I saw to the CPU was 77 degrees. It's important to note here that that number is exactly that, a spike. For the overwhelming, I mean the vast majority of this test, that CPU hovered between 67 and 69 degrees. Only when it hit that 70 degree mark and it forced the PWM and the cooler to go from 90 to 100%, that's the only time where it struggled, just in that brief little millisecond right there, to let that temp spike before the fans kicked all the way in and brought that temperature right back down into that zone. As for the case fans, I had them all running on the silent preset fan curve in the BIOS, but I also had them using the CPU temperature as a load indicator. This is the lazy man's way of doing PWM, and the only thing it really ensures is that every fan in your system will be running at 100% when that CPU is under load, and it's not always necessary. With all the case fans set to use the internal case temperature as a load indicator, now I'm asking them to work a little harder if the temperature inside the case starts to build up. Tuning the system like this so the system fan's running at about 40% or 400 RPM instead of the 1000 RPM max with the CPU under load. So I ran that whole torture test again for another 15 minutes. I saw zero impact to the CPU temperature. So how about the noise level? With the system working at max load and all fans spinning at max RPM, I saw a noise difference of about 3 dB between load and idle. That was definitely noticeable sitting right next to the case, but it wasn't offensive. With the case fans configured in the BIOS to run off a system temp, I saw a difference of 1 decibel. 1. This was barely noticeable sitting right next to the case. If you put this thing on the floor or under the desk, I doubt you would ever be able to tell if it was under load or idle. Thankfully, this case has a full-length dust filter on the bottom and a pretty good case height, so I feel like I can get away with this on my laminate floor. Keep in mind, too, that we're talking about the GPU fan running at max RPM this entire time as well. Now, your results are definitely going to vary if you have 1 or 2 monster-sized GPUs in this thing, but that's not exactly what we were shooting for with this build. Also, keep in mind, that's what this system getting absolutely pounded. Based on the usage we saw doing a simultaneous stream and a 4K 60 recording, our intended use scenario, we didn't see the system using but about 50% of its total overhead. So yeah, I think we hit the mark on this one. All the components did their job and then some, with the note that you will need a beefier GPU if you want to capture HDR. Testing for this video was a beast. I had to learn streaming and capture and OBS from the ground up, none of which would have been possible without assistance from my boy Stinger and YouTube's resident video guru EposVox. His channel is easily the most complete resource on encoding and streaming on all of YouTube. If you plan on getting into streaming at all, I highly suggest you go check out his masterclass on OBS. Big thanks again to Be Quiet for contributing all the hardware. If you'd like to grab any of this stuff for yourself, I will leave affiliate links in the description below. And we're off to the races. Be sure and follow me on Twitch at Bad Seed Tech. Might have a weekly show in the works again. We'll see. That's it for this time. I'm Brian P. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to hit that like button, hit that sub button, and until next time, stay up.